If you had fallen asleep at the start of this year and woken up today, you would not recognize the field of quantum computing, not because one company built a miracle machine, because 7 different countries, a dozen major corporations, 3 branches of the American military, and a small army of independent physicists all quietly, simultaneously decided this was the year quantum computing stopped being a laboratory curiosity and started being infrastructure. Read that again? Infrastructure, the same word you'd use for a power grid or a highway system. This is the story of everything that actually happened in quantum computing in 2026. Verified, dated, and sorted from what's real to what's still just a promise. Let's start where the year's biggest scientific fight actually began, because understanding it tells you almost everything you need to know about how this entire field currently operates. In March of 2025, a company called D-Wave published a peer-reviewed paper in the journal Science, claiming its Advantage 2 quantum annealer, a machine packing more than 5,000 qubits, had achieved something genuinely different from prior headline-grabbing claims. Not a synthetic benchmark engineered to be hard for classical computers. A real simulation of how disordered magnetic materials actually behave, the kind of physics research that matters to scientists developing next-generation electronics and superconductors. D-Wave's own chief executive, Alan Baratz, drew the distinction sharply. This was not just solving a problem that can't be solved classically, he said. This was solving an important, useful, real-world problem. For over a year, that claim stood largely unchallenged. Then, in May of 2026, a team at the Flatiron Institute, working alongside Boston University, published its own paper in Science, and the detail that made headlines wasn't the mathematics itself. It was where the calculations ran. Lead researcher Joseph Tyndall performed many of his team's earliest calculations on a personal laptop, using open-source software called iTensor, combining a mathematical technique called tensor networks with a decades-old method called belief propagation, first developed back in 1982, and left largely dormant until this exact moment. Co-author Miles Staudenmeier summarized the trade-off with genuine honesty. It's a little more approximate than some of the other methods, he explained, but it's way cheaper, and we can run it much more directly on lots of harder problems. Here's why this dispute deserves your attention rather than a quick dismissal in either direction. D-Wave didn't simply accept defeat. The company issued a detailed technical rebuttal, stating plainly that the claim that D-Wave's achievement has been overturned is inaccurate and not supported by the scientific record, pointing to specific problem geometries and measurements the classical method never actually attempted to reproduce. This is not chaos. This is precisely how legitimate scientific disputes are supposed to unfold. Publicly, technically, through peer-reviewed journals rather than press releases, and as of this recording, the dispute remains genuinely unresolved. What makes this story matter beyond one company's specific claim is the pattern it fits into. Google's original 2019 Sycamore supremacy claim faced almost identical treatment, with IBM researchers narrowing its claimed 10,000-year classical runtime down to roughly 2.5 days within mere weeks, and further classical improvements eventually pushed that gap down by 10 full orders of magnitude. Every major quantum supremacy claim in this field's entire history has eventually faced a serious classical counterattack. This year simply gave us the clearest, most publicly documented example yet. Google itself seems to have learned directly from that exact history, and its own 2026 results reflect it. In October of 2025, Google's Willow chip ran an algorithm called quantum echoes, publishing results in Nature showing the calculation completed roughly 13,000 times faster than the best classical method running on one of the world's fastest supercomputers. But the genuinely important design choice sits underneath that headline number. Unlike the 2019 Sycamore experiment, which relied on random circuit sampling, a task essentially impossible to independently verify without running the exact infeasible calculation the experiment claimed was impossible, Quantum Echoes produces a deterministic, verifiable result. A specific measurable physical quantity another quantum computer could, in principle, independently reproduce and cross-check. As of this research, no published classical counter-demonstration has challenged that specific result, a meaningful distinction from D-Wave's currently contested claim. Google didn't stop innovating in hardware alone either. In March of 2026, the company added an entirely second qubit modality to its roadmap, launching a dedicated neutral atom research program in Boulder, Colorado, to run alongside its existing superconducting efforts, citing the modality's reconfigurable connectivity and scalability. Think about what it means that Google, the company most publicly associated with superconducting circuits, is now deliberately hedging its bets on an entirely different physical approach. Sundar Pichai's own stated target remains a useful, fully error-corrected quantum computer by 2029, part of a 6-milestone roadmap ultimately aiming toward roughly 1 million qubits. IBM spent 2026 pursuing a considerably more methodical, more conservative strategy, and the company's own track record backs it up. IBM shipped its Nighthawk processor, a 120-qubit system capable of running circuits with around 5,000 gates, to users by the end of 2025, and unveiled an experimental chip called Loon, specifically built to test the components needed for a genuinely different error correction approach called quantum low-density parity check codes, using long-range connectors called C-couplers to link qubits that aren't sitting right next to each other. IBM's stated target for 2026 is verified quantum advantage, with a considerably larger fault-tolerant machine called Starling, capable of 200 logical qubits and 100 million operations, targeted for 2029. The company has even named Starling's successor Blue Jay, aiming for roughly 2,000 logical qubits by 2033. What separates IBM's roadmap from nearly every competitor covered in this video is the sheer institutional weight behind it. The IBM Quantum Network now exceeds 200 academic institutions, government laboratories, and Fortune 500 companies, all building genuine expertise directly on IBM's specific hardware platform. And unlike more speculative competitors, IBM's quantum systems are already running production science today, physically deployed alongside classical supercomputers at research institutions like Riken in Japan, handing off portions of molecular simulations back and forth with the Fugaku supercomputer in real time. China's 2026 story reveals a genuinely different national strategy, one worth understanding on its own terms, rather than simply as a mirror of what's happening in the West. In December of 2025, a team at the University of Science and Technology of China achieved below-threshold error correction on its Zhuchongji 3.2 processor, becoming only the second laboratory on Earth to reach that specific milestone, 12 months after Google's Willow got there first. But the engineering path China's researchers took to get there deserves close attention, because it genuinely differs from Google's own approach. Rather than the additional direct current wiring Google's leakage suppression method requires, USTC's team developed what they call an all-microwave leakage suppression architecture, achieving the same physics milestone using nothing but carefully sequenced microwave pulses, controlled entirely through software rather than extra hardware. Independent industry analysts have suggested this software-only approach could ultimately prove more scalable than Google's hardware-heavy method, even though China's current numbers remain numerically weaker on this specific benchmark. And China's neutral atom ecosystem has moved with genuinely startling speed throughout the year. Hanyuan 1, delivered to a China Mobile subsidiary in October of 2025, became the country's first commercial neutral atom deployment, a 100-qubit room temperature system fitting inside 3 standard equipment racks, later exported to Pakistan for that nation's first national quantum computing center. Just 7 months later, Hanyuan 2 arrived with a dual-core cabinet design consuming less than 7 kilowatts of power. And in July of 2026, at the World Artificial Intelligence Conference in Shanghai, an entirely new company called Zhongqi Wuliang unveiled Qinghe No. 1, described as the first quantum computer built specifically to slide directly into a standard server rack, no dilution refrigerator, no dedicated facility required at all. China's own 15th five-year plan, approved in March of 2026, now ranks quantum technology first among 7 officially designated future industries, elevated from second place behind artificial intelligence in the prior plan. Now let's turn to the year's single most scientifically contested story, because it deserves genuinely careful, honest treatment rather than either uncritical excitement or dismissive skepticism. On June 2nd, 2026, at Microsoft's Build Developer Conference, the company's quantum team announced Majorana 2, claiming a 1,000-fold improvement in qubit reliability over its predecessor, achieved through a genuinely strange engineering choice, replacing the aluminum superconductor in the original Majorana 1 chip with lead. A material Microsoft's own technical fellow, Chetan Nayak, admitted sounds like a crazy idea, actually. Jason Zander, Microsoft's executive vice president leading the effort, framed the achievement in sweeping terms, comparing it directly to Bell Labs inventing the transistor, and stated the company was cutting its original quantum computing timeline in half, now targeting 2029 for a scalable, practical machine. Here's where honest reporting has to slow down, because the scientific response to this specific claim was genuinely, sharply critical. Henry Legg, a physicist at the University of St. Andrews, examined Microsoft's supporting data and identified a serious methodological problem, that the dramatic results came from just a handful of instances measured on a single device. You can see something amazing in one device and never see it again because it's just some random artifact, he explained. What you need is many devices, and that's not what they're showing in this paper. Legg's overall assessment was blunt. If this was from any other group or PhD student, it would never make it through peer review. Sergei Frolov, a quantum researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, added that Microsoft's prior preprint of this exact kind has remained unpublished in any peer-reviewed journal since the summer of 2025, suggesting rejection by top journals, and offered a genuinely stark summary of how the broader physics community currently views the company's claims. When Microsoft is mentioned these days, he said, physicists and quantum computing specialists just chuckle or raise their eyebrows. This context matters enormously because Microsoft has a documented history here, including a 2021 retraction of a high-profile Nature paper after outside experts showed the underlying data could just as easily reflect ordinary material imperfections. Winfried Henzinger, a physicist at the University of Sussex, offered perhaps the starkest independent assessment of Microsoft's entire topological approach, telling Physics World that it's probably 20 to 30 years behind the other platforms. This isn't a story with a clean resolution yet. It's a genuine ongoing scientific dispute, and any honest account of 2026 has to present it that way. While Microsoft's claims generated controversy, Quantinuum spent the year quietly accumulating some of the field's most credible, least disputed results. The company's Helios trapped ion system launched commercially in November of 2025, and by mid-2026 had demonstrated 94 error-detected and 48 error-corrected logical qubits, numbers widely regarded as the strongest fidelity figures anywhere in the industry. But Quantinuum's most genuinely fascinating contribution came in July of 2026 through a collaboration with the University of Chicago, Harvard, and Stony Brook University, published in Nature. The team demonstrated something that had waited 23 years since its original theoretical proposal, a universal gate set built from braiding and fusing exotic particles called non-abelian anyons, particles that don't exist anywhere in nature and have to be artificially created by entangling many ordinary qubits together. University of Chicago researcher Ruben Verison described the significance directly. "We demonstrated a so-called universal gate set," he explained, meaning that if you store information in these emergent versions of quarks and you move them around, you can do any quantum computation you might want to do. Quantinuum's Henrik Dreyer connected this breakthrough to a specific, expensive bottleneck plaguing nearly every other quantum architecture. "Non-abelian codes are a dark horse in the race to quantum error correction," he said. "We show the first universal gate set in a non-abelian code, which demonstrates that fault-tolerant computations can in principle be done without resorting to magic state distillation or cultivation, which are the most expensive operations in standard quantum error correction codes." Verison himself was careful to note the limits of what had actually been shown. "So far, we've ignored the question of error correction," he admitted. "Here, it's more like a proof of principle. That same expensive bottleneck, the physical overhead, required to protect quantum information from errors, saw a second, entirely separate breakthrough earlier in the year. This one from researchers at Quera, Harvard, and MIT, posted as an arXiv preprint in April of 2026. Using a new family of quantum low-density parity check codes specifically designed for neutral atom hardware, the team achieved encoding rates above 50%, more than 5 times better than the roughly 10% typical of prior high-performing approaches at realistic system sizes, approaching what researchers call the teraquap regime, a performance threshold associated with running genuinely large, trustworthy quantum algorithms. The underlying trick involves a mathematical structure called affine permutation matrices, which lets the atom-rearranging lasers powering neutral atom systems complete complex error correction reshuffles, using just a handful of simple, structured moves rather than dozens of separate steps. The team's own published caveats matter here, too. This is explicitly described as a quantum memory result, proving information can be stored efficiently, not yet a demonstration of full, working, fault-tolerant computation. If 2025 was the year quantum computers proved they could keep qubits alive long enough to matter, 2026 became the year the entire field's central challenge quietly shifted somewhere else entirely, into the classical software and electronics surrounding those qubits. NVIDIA recognized this shift earlier and moved faster on it than perhaps any other company in the industry. In October of 2025, the company launched NVQ-Link, an interconnect specifically built to connect quantum controllers to classical GPUs at latency under 4 microseconds, backed at launch by 17 quantum hardware companies and 9 national laboratories. By March of 2026, that promise had become usable software through a public API, and Dell independently validated the underlying latency claims on commercially available server hardware, a genuinely important form of third-party verification. Then, on World Quantum Day, April 14, 2026, NVIDIA released Ising, an entire family of open-source AI models purpose-built for the 2 most stubborn bottlenecks in quantum computing, calibration and error correction decoding. Ising calibration, a 35 billion parameter model, compresses the traditionally days-long process of tuning a quantum processor down to hours and, according to NVIDIA's own benchmarks, outperformed Google's Gemini, Anthropic's Claude, and OpenAI's GPT on a newly introduced calibration-specific test. Ising decoding runs up to 2.5 times faster and 3 times more accurate than pi matching, the field's standard open-source decoder, while needing 10 times less training data. Within days, adoption spanned an extraordinarily diverse coalition. Fermilab, Harvard, the University of Chicago, Sandia, Cornell, and institutions across Germany, Japan, and Poland, cutting across nearly every competing qubit architecture simultaneously. But NVIDIA's strategy carries an important nuance worth stating clearly. Its software is open source, but the underlying stack it runs on is not, requiring NVQLink's interconnect, NVIDIA's Q-Day Q platform, and NVIDIA's own GPUs, meaning the company is qubit agnostic but not classical infrastructure agnostic, extending the exact same strategic playbook that made it the dominant force behind the entire artificial intelligence boom. IBM continues developing its own independent FPGA-based decoding approach, claiming performance 10 times faster than required, and in June of 2026, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise announced a competing coalition spanning Intel, IQM, Q-Blocks, Quantinuum, Quera, Quantum Machines, Rigetti, and Riverlane, connecting quantum hardware directly to HPE's own Cray supercomputing platform, proof this industry has not consolidated around a single winner. This same convergence between quantum and classical infrastructure showed up physically in real buildings throughout the year. On June 16, 2026, Oak Ridge National Laboratory launched Pathfinder, a 20-qubit system built by the Finnish company IQM, directly connected to Frontier, the laboratory's flagship supercomputer and the second fastest benchmarked machine on Earth. This marked IQM's first American installation and Oak Ridge's first commercially purchased quantum computer, with the laboratory retaining direct ownership of both the hardware and its underlying intellectual property. IQM's chief executive, John Gutz, captured the significance simply. Quantum becomes useful when it works inside real computing infrastructure, he said, and there's no better place to prove that. Travis Humble, who directs Oak Ridge's Quantum Science Center, confirmed the presence of the machine had already sped up the lab's broader integration work. Oak Ridge is simultaneously running a second parallel effort with NVIDIA and HPE, using an NVIDIA GB200 system to both connect real quantum hardware and run GPU-accelerated simulations that emulate quantum behavior without the noise plaguing actual qubits, specifically to accelerate research into low-latency decoding. Meanwhile, the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center announced its own hybrid system called TangleLab, funded by a $5 million National Science Foundation grant and built in partnership with Rigetti, with construction beginning in September of 2026. Japan matched this pace internationally, with NVIDIA powering what the company calls the world's largest quantum research supercomputer, ABCIQ, at the National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology. The federal government's involvement in quantum computing escalated dramatically throughout 2026, and it's worth walking through this specific timeline because the pace itself tells a story. In April, DARPA launched a program called HARQ, explicitly built around a philosophy that contradicts most of the quantum industry's underlying assumptions. Program manager Justin Cohen stated the position directly. It's pretty clear that on any kind of timeline that we have clear insight on, there will be no perfect qubit species or modality. National security and global military dominance, with quantum-resistant protections mandated on high-impact systems by 2030 and department-wide by 2031. This wasn't purely theoretical policy language either. In May of 2026, the F-35 Joint Program Office began preparing to modify the fighter jet's core encryption software specifically to support quantum-resistant algorithms, explicitly framed not as a routine patch, but as a fundamental upgrade to the aircraft's entire cyber resilience. And earlier that same June, scientists at the Army's DevCom Research Laboratory published results in Physical Review Applied, describing a genuinely new capability, a quantum sensor built from rubidium atoms capable of measuring the complete three-dimensional direction of radio frequency signals for the very first time, accurate to within roughly 2 degrees, covering the entire radio spectrum inside a package just a few centimeters across. Physicist David Meyer described the battlefield problem this solves directly. The modern battlefield is an extremely complicated radio frequency environment, he explained. With a proliferation of autonomous systems, there can be hundreds of distinct signal sources. Germany's Saxon Q pushed diamond-based systems further, launching commercial products that have run continuously at Fraunhofer IAW since June of 2025, reportedly exceeding the fidelity specifications written into the original purchase contract. Canada's Xanadu's built Aurora, a photonic system spanning 4 server racks connected by 13 kilometers of fiber optic cable, specifically engineered for near-unlimited modular scaling. And it's worth noting a genuinely important, credible counterweight here. Amazon Web Services has publicly described the entire concept of simply racking and stacking quantum computers directly inside an ordinary data center as, in the company's own characterization, closer to fantasy than near-term reality. A meaningful skeptical voice from a company with every commercial incentive to want quantum computing to succeed quickly. So, after everything covered across this entire year, what does the honest, complete state of quantum computing actually look like heading into the second half of 2026? The evidence supports a considerably more nuanced picture than either the most breathless headlines or the most dismissive skepticism would suggest. Genuine, verified, independently reproducible progress happened across nearly every layer of this technology stack in hardware, with below-threshold error correction now demonstrated by at least 2 separate countries using 2 genuinely different engineering approaches in software, with NVIDIA's Ising models and NVQLink interconnect solving a real, previously unsolved bottleneck standing between laboratory demonstrations and genuinely sustained computation and infrastructure, with quantum computers now physically wired into some of the fastest classical supercomputers on Earth and in national strategy, with governments on multiple continents treating this technology with a level of institutional urgency that simply didn't exist even 2 years ago. But the honest, necessary counterweight matters just as much. No credible source anywhere in this research claims quantum computing has meaningfully reduced the artificial intelligence industry's staggering energy demands this year, a distinction repeatedly, explicitly confirmed across multiple independent sources. Quantum machine learning still shows no demonstrated advantage on ordinary real-world data as of 2026, with its genuine promise remaining narrowly concentrated in a handful of specific problem types. Microsoft's most dramatic specific claim of the year remains genuinely, seriously contested by credentialed independent physicists, and every credible, independent timeline for genuinely commercial value quantum computing from DARPA, from UBS, from McKinsey, from S&P Global continues clustering around 2028 to 2033, not this year and not next year either. What actually defined 2026 more than any single chip or any single headline was a quiet structural shift in how this entire field talks about itself. The dominant question changed from, can a quantum computer beat a classical one at anything at all, to how do you actually build the surrounding infrastructure, the interconnects, the calibration software, the national laboratory partnerships, the government policy needed to make quantum computing genuinely, sustainably useful. That's a considerably less flashy question than the ones dominating headlines in prior years. It's also, judging by everything documented across this entire video, the considerably more important one, and the one this entire industry finally, seriously started answering this year. If you want to understand exactly how far each of these specific threads has moved by the time we reach 2027, the resolution of Microsoft's Majorana controversy, whether IBM's verified quantum advantage claim actually materializes, and whether DARPA's bet on heterogeneous quantum architecture starts producing real working systems, that's precisely the story we'll be tracking closely as it continues to unfold. So make sure you're subscribed before that next update arrives. Before you go, I want to know what you honestly think about everything covered in this year's update. Does the sheer breadth of verified, independently confirmed progress across hardware, software, and government policy convince you 2026 was genuinely the turning point this industry has been promising for years? Or does the continued cluster of credible expert timelines pointing toward 2028 and beyond tell you the real transformation still hasn't quite arrived? Leave your honest answer down in the comments below, and as always, I read every single one.